welcome to Void Histories, a place where the forgotten echoes of the past drift gently into the quiet of the night. Here, we do not rush through dates or battles. Instead, we walk slowly through memory, listening to the silences between the facts and feeling the weight of stories that still linger. Tonight, we open a door into a chapter long hidden in shadows, the Herero and Nama Genocide, Germany's forgotten crime. It is not only a tale of conquest and loss, but of wounds carried across generations and of voices that refuse to be silenced. As you listen, allow the rhythm of the words to settle into you, like the slow breathing of the earth itself. History is not just about what is past, it is about what remains, the echoes, the scars, and the lessons waiting in the quiet. So stay with me here, in this calm space, as we drift deeper into a story the world tried to forget, yet still whispers to us, even now. The Herero and Nama Genocide, Germany's forgotten crime. Before the world outside pressed its weight upon the land, Namibia stretched wide beneath an endless sky, where silence was not emptiness, but a living presence. The air carried the scent of dry grass and warm earth, and at night the stars unfolded like 1,000 stories written across the heavens. Here lived the Herero and the Nama people, bound not only to each other, but to the land itself. Their lives moved with the rhythm of the cattle they herded, with the pulse of rivers that cut through desert sands, and with the whispers of winds that carried wisdom from elders to children. To sit by the fire was to sit in memory, for the fire was more than warmth. It was the heartbeat of a people. Around its glow, voices softened into song, drums spoke with patience, and stories rose like smoke into the cool night air. These were tales of origin, of ancestors who walked before, of balance between earth, sky, and all living things. In the voices of grandparents, in the laughter of children, there was the assurance of continuity. Life was not hurried, nor was it restless. It was steady, like the footsteps of cattle across dry ground, like the slow turning of seasons that had shaped the land since time uncounted. There was dignity here, a quiet strength that needed no words to prove itself. The Herero were known for their herds, the lifeblood of their culture, while the Nama carried a legacy of resilience, their movements flowing with the desert itself. Together, they formed a landscape not just of geography, but of humanity, woven threads of tradition, faith, and belonging. To walk this land was to walk with ancestors, to carry history in the body, to know that each horizon was not an ending, but an invitation to remember. This was the world before the storm, a world unmeasured by foreign clocks, unbroken by foreign boundaries, unspoken in foreign tongues. It was a world where survival was not oppression, but harmony, where power was not domination, but balance, a place where the morning sun stretched gently across the earth, and each dawn was a promise renewed. But history is often a visitor uninvited. Across oceans, maps were drawn by hands that had never touched this soil. Lines were carved not with respect, but with hunger, with the cold precision of rulers and ink. Far away, decisions were made in rooms heavy with the scent of ambition, where men in uniforms and tailored coats imagined lands as possessions, and people as obstacles. The Herero and Nama knew nothing yet of these rooms, these maps, these ambitions. They lived as they always had, in cycles as old as the stars. It is in the contrast that the wound is deepest. To understand the devastation that was to come, we must first breathe in this quiet, this sacred silence of a people before their peace was broken. To see the children chasing shadows in the dust, the mothers braiding songs into their daughters' hair, the fathers walking with steady steps beside their cattle. to feel the dignity of a people whose identity was carved not by conquest, but by belonging. And so, as we rest in this opening moment, we must let our imagination linger here. For soon, the stillness of the land will be unsettled. Soon, the horizon will darken with the approach of strangers who bring promises wrapped in deception and contracts written not in fairness, but in chains. Soon, the silence of night will be pierced by orders barked in a language that does not belong here. But tonight, in this first remembering, let us hold on to what was a land at peace with itself, a people at home in their history, a sky filled with stars that watched over them with quiet patience. For once we step forward into the arrival of the colonizers, this peace will begin to unravel, and we will follow the Herero and the Nama into a darkness that history too long tried to forget. At first, the changes came quietly, almost unnoticed, as if the land itself was unsure of what was arriving. The Germans stepped onto Namibian soil not as visitors, but as claimants, their voices heavy with authority, their hands carrying flags, rifles, and papers covered in foreign words. They spoke of treaties, of friendship, of mutual protection, but their eyes rested not on the people before them, but on the land, the cattle, and the endless horizons they wished to possess. For the Herero and Nama, these agreements were puzzling. Words of law and contracts were woven into promises that sounded harmless, even hopeful. Yet, behind the calm voices and the firm handshakes, something darker lingered. To the colonizers, land was not sacred, but property. Cattle were not companions in life, but assets to be counted and claimed. What had been shared, open, and guided by tradition was now reduced to numbers, lines, and signatures. Slowly, without war, without immediate violence, the balance began to tip. Fences appeared where none had stood before. Paths that once led to water or grazing grounds became blocked by armed men who spoke a language that few understood. The rivers still flowed, but they were no longer free. The cattle still wandered, but their owners were told to yield them up, to trade them away for coins of little meaning. Day by day, the Herero and Nama felt their world tighten, like a rope being pulled slowly around them. At first, some tried to adapt. Leaders thought that by honoring these contracts, by meeting the newcomers halfway, they might preserve peace, or at least time. But peace was never the true intention of the settlers. Each treaty was not a bridge, but a chain. Each promise was not protection, but possession. With every mark of ink on paper, the Herero and Nama were being written out of their own future. And yet, life still tried to hold its rhythm. Families still gathered by the fire, children still laughed in the dust, herds still moved slowly across the plains. But beneath this surface of normality, tension began to hum like a string pulled too tight. Stories of unfairness spread. Cattle seized without reason, men punished without cause, women humiliated in markets where they once traded as equals. These were not isolated incidents. They were signs of something larger, a shadow that was lengthening. The colonizers had not come only to live among the people. They had come to dominate, to reshape the land and its inhabitants in their own image. The Herero and Nama were no longer seen as equals, nor even as neighbors, but as obstacles in the path of expansion. And once people are no longer seen as human, but as problems to be solved, the path to cruelty opens wide. In the quiet spaces of night, leaders began to gather. They whispered of the changes, of the slow suffocation pressing against their lives. Some still held on to hope that diplomacy might prevail, that reason could soften the hardness of the German hand. Others, however, began to see what was coming. They knew that power was shifting, that patience was being mistaken for weakness, and that eventually resistance would be the only language left to speak. And so, in these first signs of conflict, the seeds of war were planted, not yet sprouting into open battle, but waiting in the soil of discontent. The Herero and Nama watched as their land grew smaller, their dignity diminished, their voices ignored, and though the sun still rose golden over the desert, it did so upon a world that was beginning to fracture. It is here, in this moment of unease, that we must pause. For just as night slowly gives way to dawn, so too would these tensions give way to open defiance. The quiet anger of a people stripped of their rights was about to ignite into resistance, and the desert winds would soon carry the cries of battle. When a people are pressed against the edges of their own existence, resistance becomes not only possible, but inevitable. For the Herero and the Nama, patience had reached its breaking point. The treaties that once carried a fragile hope had become chains. The promises of protection had turned to lies. Land had been fenced, cattle stolen, and voices silenced. And in the silence, the pulse of anger began to rise, quiet at first, like the distant rumble of thunder, but growing, steady, unstoppable. The Herero were the first to rise. They gathered what weapons they could, rifles passed hand to hand, spears carried with ancient pride, and the will to fight fueled not by conquest, but by survival. Samuel Maharero, a leader of determination and dignity, stood at the forefront. He understood the risk, but he also understood that silence would mean disappearance. To live meant to resist. The first strikes came in 1904, swift and coordinated. German settlers, who had claimed the land as their own, were attacked, their farms destroyed, their expansion halted. The message was clear. The Herero would not surrender without a fight. For a brief moment, the desert carried the echoes of triumph, as warriors reclaimed fragments of dignity stolen from them. But victory was fleeting. The Germans, startled by the uprising, responded with a fury that revealed their true intentions. Reinforcements poured in, soldiers in sharp uniforms, rifles gleaming, artillery dragging across the dust. What had begun as skirmishes quickly grew into something far more brutal. The colonizers no longer sought only to suppress the resistance, they sought to erase it entirely. The Nama, too, joined the struggle. Under Hendrik Witbooi, they rose with courage, carrying their history of resilience into battle. They fought not only for land, but for memory, for the right to remain themselves in the face of erasure. Side by side, Herero and Nama warriors struck back, their resistance fierce, their spirits unyielding. And yet, the imbalance was vast. The German forces were equipped with modern rifles, machine guns, and military strategies forged in European wars. The Herero and Nama fought with determination, but each battle exacted a heavy price. Villages burned, families scattered, and blood soaked into the desert sands. For every strike of resistance, the punishment grew harsher, the retaliation more merciless. The most fateful moment came at the Battle of Waterberg. Here, the Herero gathered in strength, hoping to push back against their oppressors. But the Germans, under General Lothar von Trotha, unleashed a campaign of annihilation. Encircled and outgunned, thousands of Herero men, women, and children were driven into the Omaheke Desert. Cut off from water, surrounded by enemies, many perished not from bullets, but from thirst beneath the burning sun. The battles had begun with defiance, with courage, with the hope of preserving life. But the response they provoked revealed the true cruelty of the colonizers. This was not war in the traditional sense. It was extermination disguised as battle. Each clash was not only about territory, but about the very right of a people to exist. Still, resistance did not vanish. Even in defeat, the Herero and Nama carried their fight into the wilderness, into the hidden corners of their homeland. Small groups struck back, disrupting German control, refusing to bow completely. Survival itself became a form of rebellion, a refusal to give the colonizers the satisfaction of total victory. In these battles, there was tragedy, but also dignity. For every life lost, for every family broken, there remained the undeniable truth. The Herero and the Nama had not surrendered quietly. They had lifted their voices, raised their weapons, and declared that their existence was not negotiable. And so, as the dust of Waterberg settled and the cries of war faded into silence, a darker chapter was about to unfold. The German Empire, humiliated by resistance, would shift from suppression to extermination, from conflict to genocide. What had begun as battles of survival would soon become a campaign of calculated destruction, written not just on the land, but on the very soul of the people. It is here, in this fragile space between courage and catastrophe, that we pause. For the story is turning darker, and the next steps will lead not just to war, but to something far more enduring. Wound that history would try to hide, but which still bleeds beneath the silence of time. After the battles that shook the desert, there was no return to peace. The war did not end swiftly, nor did it allow time for healing. Instead, it dragged on, stretching days into months, and months into years, each one marked by deeper wounds. For the Herero and Nama, life became a fragile thread, pulled tight between resistance and survival, always at risk of snapping beneath the weight of the German Empire's iron will. The defeat at Waterberg had scattered the Herero into the vast Omaheke Desert, a place of silence and burning heat. There, families wandered in desperation, carrying children in their arms, searching for water that had been poisoned or guarded. General Lothar von Trotha had issued his infamous order that every Herero, man, woman, and child, be driven into the desert and denied the means to live. It was not merely an act of war, it was a sentence of death. Those who tried to return were shot on sight. Those who remained vanished beneath the relentless sun. For the Nama, the struggle took another shape. Under leaders like Hendrik Witbooi and Jakob Morenga, they continued to fight, striking German positions, ambushing patrols, refusing to surrender their land or their spirit. But retaliation was ruthless. Villages were destroyed, cattle seized, and entire communities forced into camps. These were not camps of refuge, but places of confinement, precursors to darker chapters of the 20th century. Behind barbed wire and guarded watchtowers, men were forced into labor. Women and children starved, disease spread unchecked. The very dignity of life was stripped away, leaving only survival in its most fragile form. And still, in the midst of despair, negotiations appeared. The Germans, eager to consolidate their control, offered treaties, agreements written not in fairness, but in coercion. Some Nama leaders, weary from endless battles, signed these papers, hoping to spare their people further suffering. But the promises were hollow. The ink on the page bound them not to peace, but to captivity. Their weapons were surrendered, their lands absorbed into colonial holdings, their freedom reduced to a memory. These were not treaties born of choice, but of exhaustion, documents pressed upon people who had no other road left to walk. The Herero, those who survived the desert, faced similar fates. Captured and weakened, they too were herded into camps, where the concept of humanity dissolved under the weight of cruelty. Starvation became common, punishment routine. Families were torn apart, with men forced into hard labor on railways and farms, while women endured unspeakable violations. The Germans called it order, but it was destruction dressed in the language of civilization. What makes this chapter so haunting is not only the violence of battle, but the deliberate stripping away of hope. War did not merely kill, it reshaped the future, severing generations from their past, replacing traditions with trauma. Treaties, once symbols of agreement, became shackles. Agreements, once thought to preserve life, instead ensured captivity. The war was prolonged not only on the battlefield, but in the spirit, pressing down on every attempt at survival. And yet, even here, fragments of defiance remained. Some Nama groups refused to sign, continuing their struggle in the wilderness. Escaped prisoners carried stories of the camps to those still free, fueling resistance, even if only in whispers. Mothers taught children songs in secret, holding on to identity where identity was forbidden. The will to endure did not vanish. It flickered like a hidden flame, faint but alive. By the time the guns grew quieter, the Herero and Nama were no longer the people they had been before. Their numbers had been shattered, their lands consumed, their freedom signed away under the pressure of false agreements. But their memory, though bruised, did not die. It lived in stories, in silence, in the determination to survive despite everything. And so, as the prolonged war gave way to uneasy quiet, the cost of survival was already written. Generations had been lost, communities torn apart. What remained was not peace, but scars. Scars that would pass from parent to child. Scars that whispered of betrayal. Scars that no treaty could ever erase. It is from these scars that we now move forward. For what followed the battles and the treaties was not healing, but something far more haunting. The slow erosion of families, the collapse of traditions, and the rise of a silence that would stretch across generations. It is to these wounds, and to the lives left hollow, that we must now turn. When the dust of battle settled and the thunder of rifles grew silent, what remained was not peace, but emptiness. The land still stretched wide beneath the same unending sky, but it was no longer the same land. The laughter of children had quieted, the rhythm of cattle herds had thinned, and the voices that once told stories by the fire had grown faint. War may end in the clash of weapons, but its shadow lingers in the wounds it leaves behind, wounds that stretch not only across bodies, but across time. For the Herero and the Nama, these wounds were deep. Families had been broken apart, their members scattered into camps, deserts, or distant graves. Mothers who once cradled their children now carried only memories. Fathers who once walked proudly beside their herds returned with empty hands, their dignity stripped, their strength hollowed by forced labor. The very fabric of community, once held together by tradition, had been torn apart, leaving loose threads that the survivors struggled to gather. In the concentration camps, survival became the only language. Men were forced into backbreaking work, laying railways for the empire that had stolen their land. Women endured humiliation and abuse, their bodies treated not as sacred vessels of life, but as extensions of cruelty. Children grew thin, their eyes dimmed by hunger, their futures stolen before they had the chance to dream. Diseases swept through the camps like invisible storms, taking lives silently, leaving behind only the ache of loss. These camps were not places of rehabilitation. They were machines of erasure, designed to grind away both body and spirit. Outside the camps, the scars were no less heavy. Communities that had once thrived together found themselves fractured, without land to graze, cattle to tend, or traditions to uphold. The sense of belonging began to fade. Songs once sung at gatherings became whispers of grief. Ceremonies that celebrated life gave way to funerals, too many to count. And in this grief, a new silence emerged. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of a people struggling to carry on in the face of devastation. Generations grew up in this shadow. Children who survived the camps or were born afterward inherited more than just survival. They inherited loss. They carried the weight of stories told in hushed tones, the memory of ancestors erased by violence, the knowledge that their people had been marked for destruction. Their sense of identity, once grounded in pride and tradition, was fractured, leaving behind questions that echoed like unanswered prayers. Yet even in this despair, there was resilience, quiet, unspoken, but real. A mother teaching her child a lullaby in secret so that the language of her people would not vanish. An elder passing down stories, even when the young no longer understood the full meaning, so that memory would not fade completely. Survivors, though weakened, still gathering to whisper the names of those lost, ensuring they would not be forgotten. These small acts, almost invisible, were threads of survival, weaving together the broken fragments of identity. But the wound remained. It was more than the loss of life. It was the loss of continuity, of generational strength. The Herero and Nama had not only been attacked in the present, their future had been stolen. Where there should have been growth, there was emptiness. Where there should have been hope, there was silence. This is why historians call it genocide, not only because of the lives ended, but because of the generations denied. And so, the Herero and Nama carried on, but they carried on in shadows. The wound passed down, from those who lived through it to those who came after, a scar etched into the collective memory of a people. To live was to remember, even when remembering was painful. To survive was to bear the silence of the lost, and to try quietly to rebuild a world that had been shattered. As we sit with this part of the story, it is important to pause, to feel the weight of absence, the quiet that follows devastation, the heavy truth that even when wars end, the suffering they create lingers on. For the Herero and Nama, these were not just years of survival, they were years of mourning, years of searching for a future among ruins. And from here, we begin to turn toward reflection, toward the larger meaning of memory, of acknowledgement, of the lessons history carries forward. For as deep as these wounds run, they are not silent. They call to us even now to listen, to remember, and to learn. History often leaves us with echoes, faint but persistent, reminders of what was done and what was endured. The story of the Herero and Nama genocide is not simply a tale of battles fought or treaties betrayed. It is a story of humanity tested, of dignity stripped away, and of resilience carried through the heaviest of burdens. As we come to the end of this remembering, we must pause, not only to recount events, but to reflect on what they mean for us now. The genocide carried out by Germany in what is now Namibia was not just one episode among many in the long history of colonialism. It was a deliberate attempt to erase two peoples from the earth. General von Trotha's extermination order was not written in the heat of battle, but in cold calculation, a chilling precursor to later atrocities of the 20th century. In this way, the story of the Herero and Nama is more than a national tragedy. It is part of the wider pattern of human cruelty, where power blinds itself to compassion and conquest consumes the very fabric of humanity. And yet, what is most striking in reflection is not only the horror of what was lost, but the quiet endurance of what remained. Though families were broken, though generations were scarred, the Herero and Nama people did not vanish. They carried their memory through whispers, through stories, through songs sung softly in the night. They endured the silence that history imposed upon them, surviving long enough for their voices to begin to be heard again. Survival itself became resistance, a refusal to let memory be erased, a refusal to let injustice be forgotten. Today, the descendants of the Herero and Nama still bear the scars of those years. Many continue to seek recognition, reparations, and acknowledgement from those who carried out the crimes. Their struggle is not only for justice, but for dignity, for the right to be remembered truthfully in the pages of history. And in their pursuit, there is a message for all of us that history cannot be buried, no matter how deep the silence. That truth, once spoken, carries the weight of healing, however slow. As we close this chapter, we are asked to see beyond the dates and the numbers, to see instead the human faces, the mother searching for her child in the desert, the father watching his herd taken away, the child whose laughter was stolen by hunger and war. These are not distant figures, they are threads in the fabric of humanity, threads connected to us, reminding us that what happens to one people echoes across all. The lesson of the Herero and Nama genocide is not only about the past, it is about the present. It is about the dangers of silence, the cruelty of indifference, and the responsibility we all share to ensure that suffering does not repeat. To remember is not only to honor those who are lost, it is to build a bridge toward a more compassionate future. And so, as you listen to these words in the quiet of night, let them rest gently within you. Think of the vast desert skies, the stars watching silently over the Herero and Nama, and how those same stars shine now over all of us. The wound of history is deep, but memory is a form of light. In remembering, we carry forward not only sorrow, but the possibility of change. Let us close softly, then, with a reflection that history is not only what happened, but what we choose to hold. The Herero and Nama endured a darkness that the world tried to forget, but tonight, in this remembering, we have carried their story once more. May it remind us that humanity, though fragile, carries within it the power to remember, to resist, and to begin again.